Sir Al, I'm absolutely delighted that you are giving us this time and this space in your life to share your extremely rich experience and unique experience over the last 50 years with congenital hyperinsulinism. So I want to just start by thanking you, and I could not agree with you more about why this is so important
Yeah.
and how there is still so much ignorance about this
Yes.
condition. So
Correct.
yes. I'm going to start with a question about the very beginning.
Yes.
Yes. So, how and when did you first encounter congenital hyperinsulinism in your clinical work? And what were the particular challenges
Yes.
of that time?
Yes. Okay. Well, I need to go upstream a little way before then to tell you about me being a medical student. And it's 64 years since I became a medical student at Guy's Hospital. And during my training, I made two very important decisions. The first was never, ever to go into pediatrics. And then, secondly, to choose a career in heart disease and cardiology. So it just shows you how badly wrong a career can go.
Yes.
So I could not, as a young man, take the grief and the guilt and the impact of serious illness and death of a child on its family. So I saw I'd never go into pediatrics. I resolved to go into cardiology, and my early training was focused on that, including doing my regular rotation in Oxford. And I completed that early training. And at the end of it, my professor, Professor Paul Beeson, an American who was the Nuffield professor, said to me, you need to do a PhD. So go and find a topic and find a supervisor for you. So, of course, I headed straight to the cardiac department, and the young researchers there said, Al, don't come here. Because our bosses are so important, they're so famous, they're never here. They don't have the time to give us what we need as research students. So I turned around and walked down the corridor to an empty laboratory with one man in it, a young man who had just come back from the Joslin Clinic in Boston to train in diabetology, and his name was George Alberti. He is now Sir George Alberti and one of the most famous diabetologists in the world. So here is George just coming back to the UK with an empty laboratory and hungry for success and hungry for some students to do research with him. And I was intrigued by this guy. He was there, he was for me. And so I had to change track from cardiology to endocrinology. And I found myself in a laboratory with a research project, a DPhil or a PhD project, looking at the mechanism of insulin secretion using a whole range of different models, including developing microassays to measure in tiny blood volumes insulin and other substances. And the beauty of George's laboratory was it was next door to that of Professor Sir Hans Krebs. Now, Hans Krebs is a Nobel Prize winner, one of the most famous biochemists in the world. Right next door to George's laboratory was Sir Hans Krebs' laboratory, and I became very close to his research. And I learned from Sir Hans the crucial importance of not just looking at glucose, but looking at the whole fuel economy of the researcher or the patient or whatever. And they had set up in the Krebs laboratory microassays, not just for glucose, but for ketone bodies, for alanine, for insulin, etc., etc. So in a tiny blood sample, you could look at the whole fuel economy of the person or the patient. I was intrigued by this. And George set up in his laboratory the same methods in collaboration with the Krebs team. And so I did my DPhil. I was awarded a PhD, and I then was appointed a lecturer in internal medicine to train as an adult diabetologist. And after a while, I was ready to apply for consultant positions to be an adult physician as a diabetologist and endocrinologist. And then I had a conversion like St. Paul on the way to Damascus. Why did I suddenly change my career? It was because of our little baby daughter, Sarah. She was about 9 months old at this time, and she developed an intercurrent infection, probably a norovirus or something like that. And in those days, you could call out a consultant to your home to give an opinion on a sick child. And so out came from Oxford Dr. Brian Bauer. He came to see our baby. We were a young couple with a little one. We were petrified at her illness. And I was immediately impressed by two things by this incredible doctor. The first was his ability to examine a shrieking infant who couldn't tell him what was wrong with her. And I saw his gentle skill examining this child. And then, secondly, I saw his compassion for us. He was concerned about us as worried young parents, petrified about our little baby. He reassured us. And those two things brought me up sharp. And I realized immediately that pediatrics actually was the most difficult specialty of all, because you had to diagnose a child who couldn't tell you what was wrong with it, and you had to relate to the parents, ideally with compassion. And so, in discussion with my wife, who supported me, I turned my track and had to go back and start again from the beginning to train as a pediatrician, something that just could not be done now. And that's a great shame. And here's my first action point, which is to highlight the difficulties that young people have and being committed so early in their careers for a career track and the inability to turn track as I did. So I turned track. I started from the beginning again as a resident doctor in pediatrics, but I brought to that position my competencies in measuring in microassays tiny blood samples, concentrations of fuels and hormones. And when I had to be in the hospital, I mounted a research program looking at metabolic and endocrine interrelationships in newborn babies. And one of the bits of work I'm most proud of is our work on pain in babies, because in those days it was believed that babies didn't feel pain the same as adults. It was too dangerous to give them powerful medication. And the consequence was that many of them got little, if any, pain relief during surgery. And we proved by our microassays, these babies really did experience a painful experience. And so I then moved from Oxford, where I was training, to Zurich in Switzerland to train as a pediatric endocrinologist. I was advised to go to either San Francisco, Paris, or Zurich. I didn't particularly want to go to San Francisco. I went to Paris. L'Hôpital des Enfants Malades was a dirty, decrepit Victorian building, but the lunches lasted 2 hours with bottles of wine. I then went to Zurich to Professor Prader and was impressed by this man and the fantastic resources. So he accepted me to train. I had to learn German from the start to train in Zurich. And there I took my microassays as well. And I worked with Professor Richard Gitzelman, Professor of Metabolic Medicine. And we had a baby in the Kinderspital who had severe hypoglycemia. And with the methods, we showed that this baby had hyperinsulinism. In those days, it was called nezidioblastosis of the pancreas, because it was thought this was a developmental abnormality of the pancreas. So I cut my teeth for the first time in Zurich with Rico Gitzelman under Andrea Prader, with this baby, this large baby with severe hypoglycemia. I returned to Oxford. On my very first day back to Oxford as a lecturer in pediatrics, there on the ward was a newborn baby, a very large baby with severe hypoglycemia. So on my first ward round, I could say with great confidence, this baby has got nezidioblastosis and too much insulin.
Yes, it's really something how sort of coincidences and these sort of very special moments in life,
Yes,
you personally have kind of determined your
yes,
career, and we're so lucky for those
No,
particular.
that's exactly right.
Yes,
So
yes.
there's me in 1974 as a young consultant in pediatrics, faced with a baby to care for who had all the typical features as a large baby, etc., with very severe hypoglycemia. Then the trouble really started. And that's what is so important for the kids today to understand. Now we have well-defined protocols, we have a clear diagnostic pathway, etc. We had nothing in 1974. We were faced with the reality of what do we do about this baby? With the microassays and working with the Krebs lab, we could prove this was an oversecretion of insulin. But what do we do about it? There was so little in the literature in those days to help us. We tried the recommended diazoxide, which didn't work, etc. We were then faced with the reality of performing a partial pancreatectomy, which we did. That didn't work. We went to a 95% pancreatectomy with the second operation. That didn't work. And so we were faced with the reality of having to do a total pancreatectomy, something we were so reluctant to do because of the complications arising from that. But we did that, and successfully we made the baby a diabetic, removing on the one hand the tendency to hypoglycemia, but on the other hand, creating huge problems and managing a brittle, unpredictable diabetes in a little baby. So that led to a second set of issues, how to manage diabetes in a baby after pancreatectomy. Now that's where we were in 74. And I rapidly built up a unit to deal with hyperinsulinism. I moved to Great Ormond Street 30 years ago, where we set up the first center in the country. And then the next point to make is the crucial importance of friendship and collaboration. I've told you how I was influenced by my friendship with the Krebs team, but in Great Ormond Street, I was shunted towards Professor Mark Dunn in Sheffield, and he was an interesting man who was an expert in the molecular biology and the membrane physiology of the endocrine pancreas. And so in friendship, we came together and said, look, these babies with so-called nesidioblastosis may well have a membrane problem of the pancreas, and so approved. We set up a collaboration, sending the pancreator from our surgery up to Mark in Sheffield, and he proved this amazing story that now hyperinsulinism, rather than nesidioblastosis, actually is a problem of membrane physiology. And you know, Julie, what has happened since then with the explosion of new science, the genetics of this condition. We now know so much more. So we have clear evidence as to what is going on in these babies. And I'm most proud of the paper we published in 1981, which was called Nesidioblastosis of the Pancreas, Diagnosis and Management. We set out the first diagnostic pathway, including the whole fuel economy, the fact that there is inappropriate insulin secretion, the fact these babies need huge amounts of glucose, which you can measure, to keep their blood glucose up. And then we could move into the new era of looking for focal hyperinsulinism and now the genetics. So it's really a fascinating story. And I highlight for your attention three things. First of all, the whole fuel economy. Then secondly, the reality of what it was like 50 years ago to cope with this horrendous illness and what this baby went through, with three major operations eventually leading to diabetes, and then the problems thereafter. And then the third most important point is the need for friendship and collaboration, bringing people together to a common cause with very different skills in their background. So that's my brief story, Julie.
It's a wonderful story, and I'm particularly struck by your focus on friendship and collaboration.
Yes.
And I have a particular question for you. You know, you've outlined well what you in particular were able to bring to the field. I'm wondering if you can share how you think diagnosis and management has changed with these new tools that you've mentioned?
Well, it's changed beyond recognition. It really has. Remember what I said, 1974, we did not have a clue of what to do about hyperglycemia in general, let alone the specific problem of hyperinsulinism. Now we have very well defined management protocols, the cascade of investigation. We know what's to do. We need to make sure that there isn't a focal point which can cure the baby. And at worst, we can lead children with lifelong medical treatment to control the hypoglycemia. But the impact on the family has to be emphasized. And this is something, again, that younger people in our profession are really unaware of and are not being told by the seniors, you must think about the impact on the family.
Absolutely. And so one of the things I'm really struck by you is that you're such a good listener and that you are so focused on the families. So a question I have for you is, what have you learned about congenital hyperinsulinism and the care families need directly from the families and individuals with hyperinsulinism? What have they taught you that sticks out?
Gosh, they have taught me so much, Julie, but you need to be aware of a lateral story in my life. I am privileged to be 81 years old, and I'm in my fourth professorship. I was appointed last year as the first and so far only professor of compassionate care in the UK. And my purpose in my new professorship is to confront the mismatch between the wonders of medical science, exemplified by hyperinsulinism, wonderful medical science, but the erosion of the humanity of care. And this is a very serious issue, which I'm using my professorship to highlight. I gave 50 speeches around the world last year, getting tremendous support from people, particularly nurses, who are very concerned about what nurse training schools are producing at present. They're producing nurse scientists. They have degrees. They know how to handle drips and complicated machinery. But where is the emphasis on the humanity of care? I have hard evidence, which I'm writing about, that this has been seriously eroded. And hyperinsulinism is a good, if that's the word, example, because through your good officers, we've listened. We've listened to 600 participants in our events in Lisbon, The Hague, etc. And they tell us the stories of their journeys through their child's illness. And one of the most harrowing things they tell me from my standpoint is how they were given bad news. And this has to be confronted. They tell us, and remember hearing them say this, Julie, often an award behind a curtain with no privacy, or in a corridor, or on a telephone, by somebody who stands over them and says, sorry guys, you've got a baby with a lifelong problem. But that person is not realizing the grief that these families are going through. They are grieving because they have lost the bonny bouncing baby they thought they were going to get, and now have a baby with a very serious illness, which has lifelong implications. So one of the things I'm so pleased that Chai is doing is focusing on listening to people who are affected by this. And the young people listening to this podcast need to understand we have to be compassionate. We have to understand the experiences of people and sit down and listen to them. Put a hand on their shoulder, give them a hanky if they're crying, but explain what's going on. Answer their questions truthfully, not in an arrogant, I'm a god persona.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there are so many instances where, because hyperinsulinism is so rare,
Yes.
each case can present so differently that there isn't one physician who is all knowing about this condition.
Yes.
So having a very open and honest interaction and being curious and listening to
Yes.
the parents of this new
Yes.
baby is going to help this baby, and
Yes.
it's really going to make the care so much better
Yes.
when that listening is part of the guidelines. So
Yes.
I couldn't agree more with you.
And I would argue too, Julie, sorry to interrupt you, this philosophy should affect the whole unit. It
Yes.
should affect the whole hospital. And I can tell you from my work in Australia and across Europe and the UK, there's a serious problem at present in our medical services over the focus on facts, the focus on ticking the boxes from government requirements, etc. We have lost the art of medicine. And the art of medicine is more than a diagnosis. The art is supporting, comforting, helping, touching the lives of others. I talk to medical students and they say to me, what's been the greatest reward, Al? I say it is touching the lives of others. And that is the greatest reward. Nobody talks about it to the students. So this is a desperately important facet that CHAI is taking forward, and I congratulate you on it.
Well, thank you so much. And this, you've kind of answered my next question, I think, but I'll still ask it. So what do you hope will be the legacy of your seminal work?
Gosh, well, I was asked this very question when I was being recruited for my first professorship in Newcastle upon Tyne, and the professor of divinity at the end of the interview panel lobbed this question to me: what would you want as your epitaph? That's a really great question, and I've used it in my interviewing other people since then. And in all genuine humility, I said, a man who sought excellence. And that now is embedded in the coat of arms I am privileged to have as a knight of the realm. The motto in my coat of arms, agreed to by my family and my grandchildren, is seek and achieve excellence. And that matters to what we do in our professional lives and in our public lives. And every one of my 6 young adult grandchildren gets a signet ring when they are 18 to remind them of the importance of seeking and achieving excellence. So that is my mantra.
Well, that's just wonderful. And throughout this conversation, you've talked about the 2 different aspects of being a physician that create that excellence. So it's knowledge and drive to be involved in better and better science and better treatment from the perspective of understanding the disease in a scientific way, but marrying that with listening and compassion, and together that is your legacy. That is the excellence that you have provided this community with.
Well, I hope it will be, Julie. You're generous in saying that. The mountain to climb is huge.
It really
And
is.
the current climate in the US, across the world, in the UK, for medical services, with this mismatch, as I say, between the wonders of science and the erosion of the humanity of care. I hope that can be a legacy, but it is a tough mountain to climb.
Yes. Well, we'll keep working at it.
Yes, you are. You're doing a fantastic job, Julie, on that.
Yes.
And I'll just offer very brief thoughts about, I think the most important one of all is understanding brain damage caused by hypoglycemia. And this is the big problem that so many of our families face because of a failure to understand that a baby who is floppy or not feeding or having fits could have hypoglycemia. But why does hypoglycemia cause the brain damage? And how do you monitor it? And so my vision for the future is to have an intensive care cot in an intensive care unit where on the one side, we're able to measure continually blood glucose concentrations, and then with the whole fuel economy, on the other side of the cot, we have devices attached to the baby's brain so we can actually determine how that baby's brain is working at that moment in time. And that is something which I look to for the future. I think the other important points are making sure that midwives and neonatal staff, etc., understand the importance of hypoglycemia. And this is another mountain to climb. We've just got to get into those nurseries to educate the doctors and nurses of what we're doing. Then my last wish for the future is effective advocacy. And I'm delighted to be working with you and with Chai on the Chai advocacy program. This is so desperately needed. We have to speak out for those who can't speak for themselves. And we have to demand the resources,
Yes.
the continuous glucose monitoring, whatever it is that these families need. We've got to stick our hands out with courage, compassion, and commitment, those 3 C's, through advocacy. And my final point is, we have to be much better at communicating. And in my tour to Australia recently, I was in Melbourne and met medical students. And they told me they were so concerned with the focus in their curriculum on facts and not on how to practice the art of medicine. They created a module about death and dying. And they employ actors. They employ actors to act as dying people or the relatives of dying people. And the kids are videoed in their interactions to improve their communication skills. Now, again, we've heard from your cohort of wonderful people in Chai at our events of how appalling communication can be. So this is something else to drive home. And the examples come from us, the senior staff. And I hear so much concern from resident staff about the appalling role models that so many senior staff display to them. So this is a complicated problem, but well done to Chai for everything you're doing to promote the importance of these aspects of care, which are relevant to other diseases and to other specialties, which is why I'm so delighted that our poster for the European Society for Pediatric Endocrinology on our advocacy program has been accepted.
It's wonderful.
And we've got to make sure that people listen to what we're talking about and learn from it, which is the final point. How do you measure impact? What are the metrics to measure how well you're doing?
Right. And some are very clear and some are not. So we can measure brain injury. We can measure how many people with hyperinsulinism moving forward have a brain injury. And our goal, of course, is 0.
Yes.
That's our goal. And that is measurable.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's harder to measure the compassion that families and individuals experience, but there's 2 ways to try and do that. One, of course, is to survey the individuals with the condition. And the other way is, we have our Centers of Excellence designation program, and ensuring that the centers have the right protocols and the people who work at the centers have had the right trainings.
Yes.
So those are the sorts of things we can do.
Yes, it's the cultures we have to confront.
Really,
the cultures in medicine today, the cultures in our intensive care wards. As a young neonatologist, I was appalled to discover that babies were not receiving any pain relief. And that was an example of groupthink.
Right.
Nobody had bothered to challenge it. So we have to be continually curious and continually stepping outside our comfort zone and challenging dogma.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a rich and wonderful conversation, and I'm glad we'll be able to share it with many people.
Well, I hope it will be listened to, seen. I hope it will have some impact. But I'm at this curious stage in my life. I'm 81, as I've told you. I'm looking back on my life. I'm trying to identify principles, values, experiences that have made me the person I am today. And I'm hoping that those experiences can be shared with the younger generation. They are the future. They're the people we should be focusing on.
We will share this with physicians around the world and nurses. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you.